Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Logtech Live. If this is not the first time you're catching us, if it is, so glad you could join us. Glad you heard the word. My name's Eric Johnson. I'm the host of Logtech Live, first and third Fridays of every month. And when I'm not doing this, I'm the senior technology editor at the Journal of Commerce. This is honestly my favorite part of the month. I love doing the show. I'm so glad that all of you are there to support this. I only do it because you all find this interesting, honestly. So definitely give any feedback during, before, or after the show. Would love to hear what you think of how this can be made better. But in any case, super excited about our show today. I have a fantastic guest who I've been wanting to have on for a very long time, and we finally were able to sync schedules. Super pertinent guest to talk about at this exact moment, or to talk to at this exact moment. But before that, you know how it goes. I've got a few things to promote in the coming weeks. First of all, TPM 24 and TPM Tech, which is now part of TPM, registration went live last month. The first version of the agenda went live earlier this month. We are very much on track for a fantastic event. In fact, I think we're probably ahead of schedule. If you go onto the agenda page, you'll see there's already a lot of sessions around technology that I'm leading that are already up. We'll be building that out and finalizing some speakers on that very soon. So keep that site bookmarked. And if you haven't registered, you should register right now because you have about 20 days left. Not even. You have 15 days left before the early bird discount expires on October 1st. So by the time our next show, first week of October, that early bird discount will be gone. So you should register right now. Hotels, as everyone who's ever been to TPM knows, are at a premium. So the earlier the better. Make your plans now. Meanwhile, in 10 days, I am going to be in Chicago, exactly 10 days from today, for the start of our Inland Distribution Conference. This is the JOC event that's focused specifically on surface transportation in North America. If you've listened to the show before, you know I talk about this all the time. There is no more substantive event in terms of freight transportation and logistics in our industry. I promise you that. What we may lack in bells and whistles, we make up for in serious content, and every single player, all the class 1 railroads, all the major intermodal providers, a lot of the major truckload carriers, LTL carriers, and a whole bunch of shippers. Last time I checked, I think we have 15 shippers on the program, and obviously a ton more in the audience. So you need to make sure that you are in Chicago in 10 days. There's still time to register. And then let's see, about 6 weeks from now, I will be in Abu Dhabi for the IAPH World Ports Conference, doing a whole bunch of sessions. I'll be leading around the technology side of port operations and port optimization with vessel owners. So really interesting. I've already done a few prep calls for some of those sessions, and just fantastic international group of speakers talking about best practices from a digital perspective in ports. So hopefully you can join us there. Little farther flight than Long Beach or Chicago, but also kind of a cool place to go. I'm super excited to go see Abu Dhabi myself. All right, quickly. It's been a newsy week, and in my world, it's been incredibly newsy since our last episode. First of all, unless you've been under a rock or you just don't care about the global logistics and or venture capital world or Amazon world, as we all know, last week Dave Clark resigned, was let go. I think formally he resigned. There was reports out there that he was sort of gently encouraged by the board to do so. From Flexport, we had Dave speaking at TPM last year about, kind of his roadmap for where he wanted to take the company. He was literally taking over as CEO, I think the day after our chat or the day of our chat, as sole CEO, I should say. So obviously a lot of palace intrigue on this. I think every single outlet has had their take on this. This piece I did earlier this week based on a conversation that I had with Ryan Peterson, founder, of course, and now CEO again, just about kind of the reasoning behind the change, where they go from here, that sort of stuff. There's definitely more to write. My colleague Peter Tershwell had a very interesting column midweek on JOC.com about kind of what happened at Flexport and what that says about the world of forwarding. I will be diving more into this next week as well, so stay tuned. There's more to come coverage-wise on this, but big picture, there's a lot of sort of under the hood kind of stuff that's going on with venture-backed companies that are sort of name brand now in our industry. We're a decade into the sort of, I would say, evolution of the industry, kind of adopting VC as a model to finance companies. And, some of the jury is still out on whether it's applicable across the board or whether it's actually better in specific business models, which is something, spoiler alert, that I'm going to get into with our guest in a second. But next story I wanted to highlight also touches a bit on Flexport, because they launched a product this week that was actually delayed by the news that happened last week, trying to create a solution that's a little bit end-to-end from a small entrepreneur perspective. So connecting the logistics legs with the storage, inventory replenishment, and fulfillment legs in North America. Well, interestingly, Amazon also released a product that looks really similar on the exact same day. Who knows if it's coincidental or not? I don't get into like the conspiracy theories or anything, but interesting that they came out on the same day, if nothing else. This story also talks about Maersk, which has long had an initiative to create kind of end-to-end solutions that surround its port-to-port vessel operations, buying a new automated or developing a new automated fulfillment warehouse space in Dallas. All of this is tied together, right? There's a whole bunch of interesting players trying to connect pieces that, have predominantly been segmented by international freight, inbound logistics, and outbound side on the fulfillment side. All driven, obviously, by this ever-growing e-commerce love affair that we have with shopping in North America. So definitely encourage you to read this space. This is certainly not a final take on this. This is just kind of like a state of the state as it goes in that part of the market. There's so much more to be written about that. And the last piece I'll highlight is actually one that we published yesterday based on a conversation that I had with WiseTech Global CEO Richard White. Probably most people don't need a crash course in WiseTech, but they are, more than 2-decade-old company that is, the biggest player in terms of forwarding software. They've also built a pretty big moat around their trade compliance capability. They've landed a bunch of big customers in the forwarding space over the last year, with more to come. So I had a chance to sit down with him for an hour in person last week and just wrote about some of the highlights in this story. I started with an interesting conversation we had around whether technology was enabling shippers to do more of the work that forwarders tend to do, and whether that was a threat to their business since they sell solutions to forwarders to be able to serve shipper customers. He had an interesting thought that I won't steal the thunder from. I encourage you to read the story to find out exactly what he said, but the gist of it is it's not really up to the solution provider to figure out who handles a process. It's really up to the solution provider to take away the friction from the process and let whoever wants to do it handle it. So I guess I just did steal the thunder of it, but there's lots more. Definitely encourage you to read that story because there's lots more in the story, lots more about that specific topic. It was a fun conversation and a little bit more to come from that one as well. So with that, it's time for me to bring my guest on this week. I am delighted to have Earnest Sweat, who's a venture capitalist who's focused on angel investing, but previously spent time at some pretty major funds on the VC side, both ProLogis and GreatPoint, which we will get into in a bit because I think it's interesting to dive into that. But Earnest, so glad you could join us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Eric, for having me.
Awesome. Well, so I usually start out, and this week is going to be no different, with kind of a background check on like background check is like the worst way to describe that. Sorry. What is your background? I promise I'm not doing background check.
I was like, am I going to be subpoenaed here?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
I was like,
Yeah,
wow, this is a
would love to
legit.
hear what your background is, how you got started in venture, and sort of specifically what got you interested in the world of the supply chain.
Yeah, so originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. Always say that because the two people who raised me, I think, were people investors. Like, I think if they would have known about venture capital, it would have been a natural career for both of them. My mom was a public school teacher for over 40 years. My dad was a CS grad and worked for the state of Arkansas, leading the IT efforts of their workforce development agency. And on top of that, he was a full-time pastor, still is today. So they kind of really practiced what they preached about finding a great career in which you like have a great well-being, but that career also having aspects of like, how can you constantly learn to invest in others and help them with like their goals. And the best parts of venture capital are a complete through line with that. And so, went to college, did economics at Columbia, was fascinated with the just the way markets move and change, and how like these multinational companies influenced individual and global markets, and naturally went to Wall Street. Worked at BMO Capital Markets, and then as an equity research analyst covering REITs. So I covered industrial companies, industrial REITs, multifamily, office, self-storage, healthcare, all of them. And what I got in that experience that I still use today is, how are you able to provide alpha when it could be commoditized on like what companies you should pick as stocks, or if it's just a complete downturn. I started my career in 2007, summer of 2007. So when everything was hitting the fan. Yeah. So I really had to like develop this grit and this ability to come up with a unique thesis by combining, what I was seeing at each company I covered from a micro level, and then combine that with the macro events that were happening. And so being able to do that for 4 years, at a very young age, being expected to ask tough questions to Fortune 500, Russell 5000 CEOs, and to be able to articulate a point of view, both verbally and through writing, technical writing, to various audiences, is stuff that I still use today. So did that for 4 years, then got the entrepreneurial bug, wanted to really, I don't know, I guess, democratize or disrupt how individuals develop networks. And I always say it came from my experience of going from Little Rock to New York for college, and seeing the difference of like how people really develop their network. Like if you went to public school like me in the South, to like, some of my peers will go into the Andovers and Exeters of the world, you develop your networks in different ways. And so got the bug, raised 6 figures, and then made of angel funding, and then made every first time founder mistake you could think of. And so whether that was like hiring not to my gaps, picking an extremely hard go-to-market strategy, all those things led to, within a year and a half, winding this thing down. But I was still left motivated with, I want to be in this ecosystem. I want to help founders. What function should I be in? So I went to business school at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. And that's where I was trying out things, taking entrepreneurship courses, but got an internship in venture, not in the Valley, not in New York, not even in Chicago. I was in New Delhi, India, for my summer internship. And so I worked for a venture capital firm. Yeah.
I never knew that. Do you know? That's crazy. How did we? I never knew. I spend like 2 months every year in Delhi because my wife is from there.
Oh, I did not know. Yeah. So I was living in GK1 in block. Yeah. But traveling all over India too for that summer. Cool. And I was just in love with the role. because it was everything I had in equity research that I loved, but then even more because you're putting skin in the game. And so I knew it was something I was like, this is my North Star. I want to go and get into venture capital. When you can enjoy something in 117-degree weather at all times, then you know you're on to something. And so finished up school, moved out to the Bay Area with little to no network, worked as a management consultant to really kind of land out here. But in all of my free time, I was in probably some of my work time. If you ask some of my coworkers at that point in my career, I was at every meetup. This was in 2013, 2014, every pitch competition, good and bad, but I was in love with it. And so eventually left that role as a consultant and said, I'm going to take a plunge into venture. And so through a number of like, contract roles and just networking, I was introduced to the team at ProLogis. I was their first external hire and helped them build out with no website, no really, brand within technology and startups. Ernest, you're the young guy, build out the sourcing channels, build out our thesis, negotiate deals, all just the full stack of venture. And I loved it. And so from that point on, I was just like hooked on it. And then was there for 3 years, then moved over to wanted to work at an institutional fund to get that experience as well. Worked at GreatPoint Ventures, which historically, like if you look at my story, it's about like building on top of previous platforms. So ProLogis was a very established leader in the logistics space. How do we build out a corporate venture group? On top of that, GreatPoint established since 2015. I joined in 2019. Very established firm in biotech and food tech and digital health. How do you, Ernest, apply your SaaS experience in different verticals as well as like just enterprise software overall to this group? So I was there for 3 years as a junior partner, and then a bit as a venture partner for my career, and now I'm running syndicates on my own with angels and family offices and institutional LPs, still investing in kind of, what my core kind of areas are, which is looking at how do we incorporate more technology within the 81% of GDP that's outside of the software industry. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's
a very interesting way to phrase it, what you just said at the end. And, I think most people, which leads actually into my first question, because I think most people in the world that I cover have this natural skepticism around the VC world because they see the world that they're living in as this very physical world. Even people who are at a desk doing data entry, they're extremely attuned to the fact that like freight logistics is a physical thing that needs to be undertaken by people, physically moving things, by obviously vehicles. So I wanted to ask, given that range of experience you had and the like deep love that you have for what VC can be at its best, why do you think we're a decade now into kind of like the Flexports and the Convoys and some of the names that helped the logistics world understand what VC is? Why do you think there's still a bit of a misunderstanding about what VC, or do you think there is? Actually, let me start off with, do you think there's a bit of a misunderstanding, and why do you think there is, if you do?
Yeah, there's probably a misunderstanding from both sides. VC's understanding of kind of the supply chain and operators within that world and how it really interacts, right? Like if you really look at the ecosystem, if you look at some of those market maps, if you're not really in the industry, you don't have people who work in it, can understand the nuances, it looks very confusing because there's a lot of like frenemies, essentially. Like, okay, are these two competitors, but then they work together here in this part of the value chain? And so I think there's some misunderstanding there. And then from, talking to, peers that are, operators within the logistics space and supply chain realm, there could be a perspective that, you know, venture is, especially with kind of that physical like approach, that it's not really needed, or they don't understand the space, or, you know, is venture capital even the right thing um, for like companies going through that scaling in that industry? And, you know, I think it's a couple of things, right? So I'm biased, right? So I wouldn't be investing in these areas if I didn't think there was opportunity. But I think logistics, like I'm seeing in healthcare services, like I'm seeing in insurance, like I'm seeing in retail, um, and just real estate and overall, there are three things happening, and that have been happening over the last 20 to 15 years, or 15 to 20 years. One, um, the legacy processes or legacy systems, whether it's on-prem or just, as you mentioned earlier, very manual processes, are not equipped to deal with today's very complex business environment, right? Like we got a lot of micro and macro trends going on. Like we have both globalization and deglobalization happening at the same time, right? Two, because of that complexity, we've seen an uptick from business owners, most critical stakeholders, their customers and their employees, both demanding more transparency and more speed in like every aspect of, you know, their business operations. And then three, which is probably one of the most critical, is we're in the wonkiest labor market of all time. Like we've noticed that this trend of labor, like our just labor market and supply of laborers is dwindling because we're not having enough children at the same pace, right? And having the largest generation start to, you know, go on.
And cutting immigration
Yeah,
channels as
and,
well.
and exactly, and cutting immigration channels. So all that equals up to, if you look at those three macro events, is that no matter if you're running an SMB to a Fortune 100 company, you as a business leader, you're going to be expected to do more with less resources over this next, you know, decade and 2 decades. And so, what is the natural like, you know, solution? And that's to really adopt technology. And so that's where I think, despite saying, hey, these are really physical world, the physical world needs to be digitized. And I think we're just in the first stages. If you look at other industries that maybe were like 5 years or 10 years ahead of transportation, we're going through the natural path of like a lot of tech-enabled services, really digitizing the first kind of like, hey, this is the next first wave. What's the reaction to that? Usually you start to see other larger players then look to, you know, either build out their own technical expertise or really partner with other folks. And then you start to see more actual like software SaaS applications and infrastructure applications apply because of this kind of maturation. So we're still pretty early in that, and that's why I like to invest. I have like this fantastic four product types that I love to invest in each of these different industries that helps with that adoption kind of curve of technology, and that's a lot more vertical SaaS than a lot of middleware people don't think about. So this integration layer, a lot of B2B marketplaces. And then four is, you can't really jump the gun, but this also needs to be added, is user-friendly AI. So
I didn't even have a question about AI, but that comes up every show now. So maybe if time permits, we'll get into that because that's a super interesting element. But okay, I was going to ask you. You beat me to it. I was going to ask what is not just what is the most interesting areas to invest in, but for me, I think back to like how I've covered this space over the last decade and about how maybe investors early on were addressing the space and what was interesting to them versus now a decade in understanding how the business models actually work and like what gross revenue is versus net revenue. And so I think about I was thinking about this over given what's been going on, right? Like we've seen layoffs at some big companies. We've obviously seen this big change. We've seen report of huge regression in revenue. But I think you just said vertical SaaS, right? I think if you look at it, most of the biggest companies, the biggest names to have raised a lot of money, so the ones getting a lot of oxygen and attention, are none of them are actually SaaS.
Yeah,
Right?
it's mostly it's most tech enabled services. What you need to have is like a precursor to having more SaaS.
Yeah, digital intermediaries, marketplaces, a lot of data providers, I would say, that want maybe to sell SaaS, but they're actually more useful as data providers, right?
Yeah.
So that to me has been a big kind of thought bubble over the last week about like why this continues to be this round peg in a square, or a square peg in a round hole kind of situation, which I don't necessarily think is true, right? I just think people tend to generalize, like, oh, this VC backed company is having a bit of trouble, so VC doesn't work, right? Without realizing, oh wait, there's 100 companies that you may not have even heard of yet that would never gotten off the ground if they hadn't looked at VC as a early stage kind of fuel for them, and they'll end up being really impactful companies.
Yeah.
The middleware thing is a perfect example, right? Like, not something that may be a name brand, but it's like all the software that you rely on might be using this company that's come up, right? And the only way that company comes up is because a venture group took a chance on them at a very early stage, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think see, especially today, to really like zero in, let's look at specifically, you know, the logistics and supply chain space and how over these last decade with venture capital being infused in it, is it basically, you're asking like, is it a good thing? Has it worked? And it's just like venture doesn't work like that, one, because 10 years is just still very early, especially when you look at how long companies have been staying private, which just pause there.
What do you mean by that? This is a super interesting point. I just want everyone to like understand what that
means. Because you know, maybe 20 years ago, it was like, you know, companies stay private for like 7 years before like exiting and going public, right? And that just hasn't been the case. Well, even when you look at the most consumery tech company that has a lot of growth, or you look at a great infrastructure company, like what's something, there's so many companies now that you would assume are public that aren't, right? Like Stripe
with huge revenue.
Like huge revenue. Stripe is not public, right? So I think that's going on. And so it's still very early to see. People need to have the chance to land the plane. So that's one thing. The other thing is it's all about context and timing. If you really zero out and look at the macro level of it, and it's like, it's just a hard time right now for everybody. We're in this, like, we had a Black Swan event happen that nobody was ready for. Then we had an influx of cash from different governments, right? That kind of like softened it. And all that needs to be flushed out. And so now we're in this period of like, are we going to have a recession? Are we not going to have a recession? Has it already happened only for like industries that ran hot, like banking and software, you know, even logistics. And so all those things are happening while these companies, you know, that have been the brand names are trying to figure out, all right, how do we land these planes? And so it's kind of a wait and see. Like if we look at the insurance industry and insurtech, there was a ton that came out that were just purely insurance companies with tech-enabled services, essentially. And, you know, that industry was being judged by, you know, I won't name the company, but like this public company is a failure. This public company, nobody should invest in insurtech. No, actually, they've encouraged a lot more, you know, technology to be used. So maybe it's like there actually be what we've seen in this next wave, and I've invested in a company around this, is you're seeing more the willingness for the more established brokers and actual insurance companies to take on software partners that can power them to be more efficient. And so,
and we've seen that in logistics big time, right? Like for every company that wants to say Flexport isn't doing anything different, I guarantee you, they are all talking internally and externally about technology in a way that they never did before Flexport came around.
Absolutely. And then even, Amazon before them, right? And
Of
they're
course.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's too early. But then, okay, here's kind of the other points. Innovation is happening at such a like fast rate today. Let's think about just like all the AI things that are happening.
Yeah.
Where I was reading another venture firm's like report on just like they do a lot of reports on the cloud, right? Bessemer's Cloud 100. And
Yep.
they were saying their prediction is in the next 10, 15 years, you could probably see that most of the companies that'll be in this kind of the biggest software companies in the world will reach unicorn and on status. And I don't think they were using that, but it's more probably revenue mark with
Yep.
way less employees because of the use
Sure.
of AI being able to empower people. And
If it
so,
can code. Yeah. I mean,
so
like if AI can code, you don't need like 25 engineers anymore, right?
exactly. And so that just empowers your humans to do what humans are really good at is like new complex problems, right? And so
Sure.
given what I've overlaid in the like earlier about like the three things I'm seeing happen and the labor market and all that stuff, there's also, the ability that as more venture goes into a space like logistics, that companies can pass these kind of earlier first stage big names because they can scale a lot faster with a lot less people. So
Right.
that's something we're gonna have to worry about, or not worry, but like look at too. Is like, what is going to be that average time period of an exit, especially IPO or selling fast if somebody scales faster, because
Yeah.
some people might lap these companies because there's just a new model, new technology to even like empower their own organizations.
So a couple things. God, this is super interesting. I'm already looking at the clock, and I'm like, we don't have enough time to discuss all this. But next time we'll do like a 2-hour episode.
Oh,
But
director's cut.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But so two things. That the part about like building a business that is essentially able to do things that businesses today do, but with far fewer people, is something that I think, both on the buyer side, but also the technology vendor side, has not been talked about a lot, right? Like we saw during the pandemic, obviously we saw all that government infusion of capital leading to a lot of consumer demand, which led to a lot of obviously consumer, but also industrial software, growth. And I mean, I think Ryan at Flexport even said it during one interview that like they were accidentally profitable because the rates were so good, right? Like their mandate was to grow, not be profitable at that stage, right? But if you strip it all back, like the whole point of software is to enable people to do more with less. It's not to like keep adding people at the same scale as you have before you use the software. So I tend to agree with you, and I want to get back to this idea because this is fascinating. I remember, I think it was Mark's sister at Upfront wrote something about this a long time ago that I've kept bookmarked about that time of companies staying private being longer and what that means to the industry that it's sort of trying to change. And I think about it from the perspective of we still in logistics supply chain. Well, I'm going to focus on logistics.
Yeah.
We haven't had this benchmark set yet from an IPO or some, massive company from outside our industry paying a huge multiple to acquire one of these names, right? That theoretically could have gone IPO'd. You're at an early stage, right?
Yeah.
Like, how does that lack of a benchmark that yet to happen, how does that impact like who you look at, how you price the deal, what their valuation is at an early stage? Like, do we need that benchmark?
Well, eventually you do, right? Or it could be kind of like a no man's land of like, okay, this space doesn't work, right? Like unless there's some like very big change that happens, right? Like even let's look at, when people have jumped into industries and even the worst case, right? Like that early 2000s or mid 2000s wave of going into clean tech, right? Most of those firms, like, those funds didn't do that well, right? Like you could say like the Teslas and like, but this is few and far between. But even just having one shining light, right? Like in that space helped And then I think what's happened actually in the world with more global warming has helped people say, okay, we need to invest more in this space. So one benchmark would be really helpful. But for me, at the early stage, when I'm looking at seed, Series A, it's about, where do I see the market today? What indicators do I have? Still at the early stage, even when they have pilots and customers, is how big can this get? And one of the biggest factors on that is who the founder is. And so I kind of look for, let's stay with like logistics, but I'll apply this to all my like foundational industry entrepreneurs, is there's been two types of, archetypes of founders I've seen thus far, and an emerging third that I'm like assuming will come, that have been successful. One is what I call the innovative insider. This is somebody, like Nick from Airspace, who started a business. Maybe it was just a normal kind of like supply chain business, built it up, saw that there was a problem, and saw that like there's technology that could solve it, not just for his own company, but for a lot of other companies, right?
Right.
And so that innovative insider, the real key that they have is their ability to like really build a vision and identify like where a large North Star is. But then the ability also to mobilize technical talent to really join in this journey. The second archetype that I look for is the humble outsider. So this is your stereotypical product person, management consultant, techie, who goes in, sees that the industry like has some efficiencies that technology could solve, but they do it in a manner that's not really coming from a lot of hubris, but they take the time to understand and surround themselves with advisors, potential, customers who help co-collaborate to really understand the nuances of the space so that their technology vision doesn't really scare off their customer base. And then the third that I'm seeing, that I'm predicting will come up more and more, is this kind of what I call a bridge. Somebody who like grew up in the supply chain space, like maybe family ran a business, but then they also like went to Caltech or MIT. And so they're able to bring together both worlds. And so what I'm just getting at is like a lot of it, to really be good at this venture space, which first of all has a long time span to determine if you're good or not. It's kind of like, I always joke around and say it's kind of like rap music. Like just because somebody has a lot of ringtones at the time, that just aged me, or just like has a lot of singles, right, a lot of streams, doesn't mean that they're doing well. Meaning if you just have a lot of noise doesn't mean
a lot of noise. I get it.
So the long time frame really is like that takes the long time frame of just like seeing of like where a space will go isn't as important as, do I believe this person can take and create something new? And to be good at this space, you have to, the best thing is to pick something that is not obvious and that wins, right? Because you can get a low price and other people aren't seeing the value. And that founder is able to really scale that company and get the value as they grow. So that's a long kind of answer of what I look for.
I think if I'm taking away, and I'm hoping people take away from this conversation, is I think there's been a misconception about how quickly it takes to figure out if a venture investment has worked. Because I think the opposite, it's counterintuitive to how I think most people see this. Most people see venture as like this sort of like get rich quick thing where you put a ton of money in and you figure out really early, and it's like get them as big and growing as fast as they can. And if they don't make it, you cut them aside. If they do, so I remember a investor who's also a founder told me his job when he's raising money is to go to his investors and say, I want to invest in this. Do you back me? And then I convince them, and it's like, and now we wait 8 years, and it's like, and that's always stuck in my head in terms of like, you have to have a long, like appreciation for how this is going to go. And I think it's an interesting time, right? We probably haven't gotten enough. We don't have enough time to get into something, maybe a quick thought on this, but like this point in time has been a tricky, like last year and a half to navigate, right? Because the public markets kind of got closed up a little bit. That had a huge ripple effect on the private markets and who wanted to invest in VC over the last year.
Yeah.
Public markets are doing okay now, right? Like they've kind of recovered, but it's been a little bit slower on the venture side. Are we kind of like, is there a light at the end of the tunnel, or is it still a little bit of like time to work out like all the fat food that we ate during the pandemic that maybe wasn't so good for us?
Yeah, I think, this is, and you can tell me if I'm getting too insider baseball-y on venture, but a lot of it is that a lot of funds raised a lot of money.
And they had to deploy it.
And well, there's questions on if they had to deploy, but, and if they had the discipline to really deploy. And so we're having impact from, firms going from we usually deploy one fund over 3.5 years to some got to like 18 months, and hearing other stories of like people spending, deploying $1 billion fund in 12 months. And that's just like, there's going to be issues that come from that.
Right.
And so it's, I think, it's a tricky time because of all it's going to take some time for things to really flush out. But even with that, there's still a lot of capital and dry powder that companies have, that venture firms have. And so
the capital call from investors that they haven't even made, right? So
yeah. And so I think that people are really, especially the growth stage, is really waiting on what happens in this IPO market. Are these companies that have been, publicized, are they really going to market, good companies? And then seeing how they do, I think is going to determine, it'll be a ripple effect on, okay, now growth this is the multiple that makes sense for everybody. Now, like, the early, Series A, Series B, this is what they can do, and then it'll go down and down. But this is why you, as a venture capitalist, like, especially at the early stage, you need to be aware of all those things. But like, it's such a long period till most of your companies get there that you still need to have conviction in what you're investing in and know what you see is like valuable in the space. And so that's why I'm still committed to, there's so much still to do within logistics and industries like it. So that's why I'm committed, because I think there's going to be better and better founders coming to this space.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. There's the founders that are coming out of early stage ones that came up 10 years ago that we haven't even figured out how cool the things they're going to build are. So, all right. We have like 2 minutes left.
Okay, cool.
I have 2 quick questions. I somehow realized at some point in the stage, we're both huge Hoops fans.
Yeah.
This is a super lame question, but like, who's your favorite team? And also what can you take away from like playing and like loving the game, and how do you apply it to your like day job?
So I grew up in Little Rock, as I mentioned, and because, as a quick aside, because before I was even born, the city of Little Rock didn't let Fred Smith start FedEx in Little Rock like he originally planned. I didn't have a home team of the Grizzlies, so that happened. No offense to all the Memphis fans, I'm not trying to steal your team, but it would have probably been my team.
Yeah.
But since it wasn't like that, I really had like a English Premier League approach to like basketball, where it was like, who are my favorite stars? And so I fell in love at the game. I was talking to a friend about
players, for sure.
Yeah, players. And I fell in love with the game, probably the finals of 1993. And I just started following everything. And so, it was Jordan, it was Penny Hardaway, it was Grant Hill. Like Grant Hill was probably my favorite player, because who else could convince you to buy Fila shoes?
I used to sell those. I used to sell those shoes in college when I was at a shoe store. Used to work at a shoe store. I remember the hits.
But real quickly, answer your question. So, like, huge love for the game. I got pretty good in AAU basketball. A couple, one state title in my at high school. Was a 4-year letterman. AAU, I got to play against LeBron when I was 15. Got to play against Chris Paul when I was 17.
Oh wow!
So real hoops head. Didn't grow. I was 6'1" at 14, and I'm just 6'2" and a half. And at the time, they weren't teaching everybody to be great, 3-point shooters. So what it's taught me is like teamwork. right? How to identify people's talents, how even if
Bring it
you,
out.
yeah, and if you're like me, I'm like a Swiss Army knife of a player. If I need to score 15, 20, I can, but if I need, if the team is lacking, I need to like defend the best, score on the other team, I'll do that. If I need to
Yeah.
help with assists. And so just really identifying how to meld with people.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the hooper I am. So.
All right. Well, the early '90s were I grew up in LA in the '80s, so
Okay.
I'm a Laker fan. That the Bulls kind of put the end of my dynasty. So, but love it. I stopped growing at like 14 at 5'8". Unfortunately, I thought I was going to replace Magic.
Okay.
For the Lakers. So. All right. Real quick, we're going way over, Nicole, my awesome producer, today. What's your favorite band or musician, and you have to tell us why? It's a hard one. I know everyone struggles with this, right?
Yeah, man, that's tough. It would probably have to be Jay-Z. Like, I fell in love with as like I was probably like 10 or so. What was I? No, maybe a little bit older. But when Volume 2 came out, and Hard Knock Life, which was like so smart for him because like it brought in this other fan base, and then I just went back to all the other stuff that I probably should have been listening to at that age.
not a 10.
Yeah. But I was like, this guy is like a lyrical genius, and like just been super impressed with just like his evolution and like family and business and like, I love Jay-Z. So.
All right, that's fair. I think someone else, one of my previous guests, also said that. So I think he's in the lead now.
Okay.
It's been a pretty diverse group of. I keep threatening to make a playlist out of my guests' favorite artists, but I should do it. Ernest, this has been awesome. Like I said, we probably could have gone on for another hour. How can people reach you?
Yeah, so people can reach me. I think you guys have me connected on LinkedIn or linked to this. But then on Twitter, it's also at Earnest Sweat. And so just reach out to me. I'm, right now still investing in companies, but doing something interesting where I lead syndicates into specific early stage companies. And so work with a lot of angels and fund of funds and operators. So if you're interested, just reach out to me.
Cool. And just to have a chat, Ernest, great to talk with. So thanks so much for making time today. It was awesome. I know we've been trying to do this for like a year, so I'm so glad we can make it happen.
Thanks for being patient with me.
Awesome. Yeah. Talk to you soon. All right. We are way over. I don't think I've ever gone this far over, but that was too good a conversation to stop. So real quick, thanks, David. Thanks, Lucky, for chiming in. I think there was one other person who said they were coming. Double. Thanks so much for listening in from India. Great show. Really, I learned a ton. I hope you all did about kind of the inner workings and thinkings of the venture world. Real quick before we go, dad joke of the week. This was brought to me by my friend Brian Glick at Chain.io. What do you call a line of guys waiting to get their haircut? A barbecue. That's a really good dad joke. That's like a archetypal dad joke. In any case, thank you so much, everyone who tuned in today. Really appreciate the support for the show. As I said, I only do this because you guys tune in. So thanks to Ernest. Again, thank you to Nicole. Thanks to Sarah and her team at Let's Talk Supply Chain. We will be back October 6th with our next episode. September's a 5 Friday type of month. So not in 2 weeks, but in 3 weeks. So thank you to everyone, and hope to see you at Inland in 10 days, and we can talk about it on the next show. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.